So I get the pleasure of doing an update on arboviruses in the US and arboviruses in Texas. And I am a little bit at a disadvantage talking about arboviruses in Texas because the data that I have to pull with comes from ArboNet. And so sometimes states have a slightly different definition of what is a case than what the CDC accepts into ArboNet. So just be aware that some of the numbers I'm going to present here are maybe a little bit different than numbers that would be presented by the state. And usually my experience is that the states have more cases on their files than we get through ArboNet for whatever reason. And then the other disclaimer, actually I have two disclaimers, the first one being this is my opinion and not necessarily the policy of CDC, but the other disclaimer is that all of the data for 2014 that I'm going to present is provisional data still. So we don't close out the books for the numbers of cases of an arbovirus that happened in 2014 until sometime around now, because sometimes there are lags in states reporting numbers and we want to make sure that we're not having to go back and make corrections. So we kind of leave the books open for a period. I believe they're getting ready to shut that and make these final numbers. So what I present for numbers today is probably not too far off from what is going to be final case counts for 2014. So ArboNet is a national arbovirus system for recording arbovirus information, and it includes both cases. It includes mosquito pools. It includes horses and other mammals that are positive for arboviruses, human data, basically for all of the arboviruses that are reportable or required reportable arboviruses in the US. This is a passive surveillance system, so we rely on the states, who in turn rely on, to a large part, on mosquito control districts and local physicians to actually do due diligence and report cases. So all of the numbers here are more than likely underrepresenting the true number of cases that are occurring in the US. There are a lot of different things that go into ArboNet. Like I said, there are birds, and certainly sentinel chickens are used for some of the diseases. They're not so good for other diseases, particularly things like lacrosse encephalitis, because the host for lacrosse encephalitis is small mammals. So you're probably not going to catch that in sentinel chickens. Dead birds are not recorded that frequently in most jurisdictions, but if that information is reported to ArboNet, we do put it into our system. Very few places will actually capture live birds and bleed them and look for antibodies because of the manpower going into catching live birds, but also you need all sorts of extra permitting to handle songbirds. Mosquito pools, this is the most common non-human information that goes into ArboNet. It's predictive for many of the arboviruses in the US, even if it's not going to be very useful for dengue or chikungunya. Horses, we don't tend to see a lot of horse cases come into ArboNet anymore, and that's because there are vaccines for almost every single arbovirus that affects horses in the US. It's much easier to develop a vaccine for the veterinary side of things than it is for the human side of things. And then humans, they're not a good surveillance, except for perhaps chikungunya, because so few of them actually present that you can have arbovirus transmission and people being infected in an area but not pick it up because only 20% of them are actually going to show symptoms. And also, the idea behind all of this surveillance is not to count how many people got sick last year, but to try to detect these things in real time so you can actually make an impact on future transmission and try and prevent people from becoming sick in the first place by doing vector control. So with that, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to talk about some of the different arboviruses in the US, what status is on them, and what's been happening here in Texas on them. The first one I'm going to talk about is Eastern equine encephalitis. One thing, Texas is in the dubious position of being in the center of the US, so you guys have mosquito species, western mosquito species in the state, you have eastern mosquito species in the state, and everything in between. So you guys catch just about every arbovirus in the US somewhere in Texas. So Eastern equine encephalitis, it's an alpha virus. It is associated with freshwater swamps, hardwood swamps. It is a bird virus, so there is a bird mosquito cycle, which is usually Culiceta melanura, which is found in these swamps with the birds, with the virus. But it does spill over into humans and horses, and so there are several different mosquito species that are important in moving it out of the swamp and into the horses and humans. So Culiceta melanura won't readily feed on a mammal. It is a very ornithophilia mosquito. I probably didn't pronounce that right, but so this is the distribution of Eastern equine encephalitis. The kind of, as the name suggests, it's found in the east. This color means it's historically not found in these states. It is found through surveillance of mosquitoes and horses and other means in the states in the blue. And then human cases have been recorded from these states in the yellow. And so you could see it is definitely an eastern virus. This is from 1964 to 2014. Again, 2014 is provisional data, but I don't think the numbers are really going to change at this point. We get roughly 6 cases on average reported to the CDC per year, so it's not a very common virus, although there are some years where you can have pretty intense local outbreaks of this virus. And this virus is a pretty harsh virus, so it has a high mortality associated with it, and those people who are lucky enough to survive, some might say are unlucky enough to survive because there's usually in the survivors permanent brain damage. Particularly with kids. And this virus does tend to attack the very young as well as the very old. So in 2014, we had 8 cases. You can't really see, this is a case by county map. So if you guys are not familiar, CDC works with the U.S. Geologic Service, and we have these disease maps that are online, which are updated weekly. So you can go to those sites and you can click on Eastern equine encephalitis, and you can look at all of the information by county in the U.S. For the number of human cases, if it's a disease associated with horses, how many horses have been reported, how many mosquito pools have been reported, all of the information, sentinel chickens, how many of those cases have been reported as well. So it's a really handy tool to look at throughout the year as the mosquito season is going on. As the arbovirus season is going on, actually. So those 8 cases are actually up here in the Northeast. I know you can't see the little pink on it, but they're up here in New York and in New Hampshire. There were no cases in Texas of eastern equine encephalitis in the last year, although you do have cases here in the state occasionally. Western equine encephalitis, this is an alpha virus. It's kind of the counterpart of eastern equine encephalitis, but it occurs in the West. It's associated with irrigated areas and floodplains, and that's because that's where the primary vector, Culex tarsalis, likes to live. It is a floodwater Culex. It likes flood irrigated pastures in particular. That's a real good place to find this mosquito. Culex tarsalis is also the primary western vector of West Nile virus as well. Again, this is a bird virus that occasionally spills into the human population and also attacks horses. This particular virus is why the CDC has offices or a field lab in Fort Collins, because there's huge outbreaks of this arbovirus in the past, and so they set up labs to study the arboviruses, and we have really been lucky in that we've never been called back to the mothership in Atlanta. So this is the historic range of Western equine encephalitis and where human cases have been reported. And then historically, it's never been found in the eastern U.S. And more than likely, that's because even though Culex tarsalis is found throughout all 48 lower states, it's really not found abundantly anywhere really east of the Mississippi River. So you can occasionally find a Culex tarsalis mosquito in Florida. It has been collected there, but it's not abundant enough to drive transmission. The other thing about Western equine encephalitis is that even though we had huge outbreaks of this disease in the past, we really don't see human cases of it anymore. And so really, since 1999, we have not had a human case of Western equine encephalitis in the U.S., although you can see here that in the past there have been outbreaks, periodic outbreaks of it occurring. And we do still get, in our surveillance, we still get positive mosquito pools, particularly if you look at this map, even though there have never been human cases in Nevada, we get positive mosquito pools out of Nevada all the time. So why don't we ever see human cases? I don't know, but I'm not sad about that. So on average, it says 24 cases per year, but that is driven by these big outbreaks in the 60s and 70s. And again, we haven't seen any of this virus in the last 15 years. Lacrosse is a Bonia virus. This one is a little bit different because instead of being a bird virus, this one is a small mammal virus, particularly eastern chipmunks and little ground squirrels. 80s, I should have changed that back to 80s. Triceriatus is a primary vector. This is a woodland virus. It tends to be found in hardwood forests where you have the chipmunks. And so therefore it's really found in rural areas and not in urban areas. And this particular virus is incredibly hard on kids. This virus, children are the primarily attacked by it. And again, just like the eastern equine encephalitis, often they will survive it, but they will be brain damaged for the rest of their life. This is the range of lacrosse encephalitis. Outside of West Nile virus, lacrosse encephalitis is the second most abundant number of cases that we see each year, the second most common arbovirus. And most of the cases usually are actually found here in this Ohio River Valley area. West Virginia is a real big hot spot, but the most often this is the area of the U.S. where we see this virus, although you can see it does occur in Texas. Usually about 78 on average cases per year. So again, we see this year in, year out. You can see that there are some years where kind of in a cycle of every 10 years or so, we kind of get an uptick of cases, and then it dies down, and then it starts going up again for whatever reason. You can see probably a little bit better the pink counties in here. Again, this is commonly where we see the most cases in the U.S. Last year there were no cases in Texas. However, the year before you had a couple of cases in the state of Texas. So it does occur here rather regularly. St. Louis encephalitis. This one, in a little bit, you'll see that the average number of cases is maybe a little higher than the La Crosse, but it's more of an epidemic virus in that you tend to see a lot of cases and then no cases and then a lot of cases, as opposed to La Crosse, where you kind of see the year in, year out, at least about 70 cases. So SLE, it's a flavivirus. There are different habitat associations with this. It does tend to be a more urban virus, and that's because the primary vectors of it are our friends Culex pipiens and Culex quincifasciatus, which are urban species. Again, we're back to a bird virus, so there's that bird-mosquito cycle. And there are other vectors that are also locally abundant and local drivers of SLE. So like Culex nigropaulpus in Florida. There's a Culex salinarius up in the northeast of the U.S., which can locally be a driver of SLE, but for most of the U.S., in the northern part, it's Culex pipiens. In the southern part of the U.S., it's quincifasciatus. And then in the west, it is Culex tarsalis. And so in the west, you actually tend to see a little more spillover into the rural habitats. So human cases of SLE, nobody knows why it's never been found in South Carolina. If you guys figure it out, let me know, and I'll pass it on to L.A. Williams in South Carolina. But it's a very widespread virus in the U.S. And the average is 93 cases per year, with a range of anywhere from 2 cases, which was 2013, very low year for SLE, up to almost 2,000 cases. In the previous slides, it was a linear scale for the y-axis number of cases. I do want to point out that this is a log scale, so while it looks like there's not a whole lot going on in these epidemic years, that's a lot of cases in these peaks. And again, there seems to be a slight cyclical activity of this virus, that it tends to drop down and then have flare-ups about every 10 years or so. Since West Nile virus was introduced, we have not seen big flare-ups of it necessarily, but that doesn't mean that the virus has gone away. We still get detection of this virus every year. So what's going on with SLE? In the U.S., there were only 10 cases last year, so it was a very, very quiet year for SLE. but 4 of those cases occurred here in Texas. And in Harris County, Chris can set me straight if I'm wrong, but they detect SLE almost every year in Harris County, and SLE was a big driver for why that Harris County program came into existence in the first place. And I don't see Chris jumping up and down saying, you're wrong, so I'm going to stick to that story. West Nile virus, this is the most abundant virus in the U.S. right now. It is found in urban, suburban, and rural habitats, and what drives that is what particular species is in the area. Again, it's a bird virus. The vectors in the east, just like SLE, are Culex pipiens and Culex fasciatus. So in eastern states, it tends to be an urban disease, whereas in the western states, it tends to be more rural in nature because of that Culex tarsalis, which is a very, very efficient vector of West Nile and SLE. And again, locally, there can be other species involved in transmission. There have been some cases even where Aedes albopictus has been implicated as driving a local outbreak of West Nile virus. So there are numerous other species that can be locally important, but the ones listed here are the primary ones. So West Nile virus, we now have human cases in all 48 lower states. We have not had any cases out of Alaska or out of Hawaii, and I'm sure those 2 states hope that that never changes. There is the possibility it can occur in Alaska, particularly along the coast. It does occur in Canada, so there's no reason to believe that it couldn't also one day show up in Alaska. We just haven't had any cases reported yet. So West Nile virus showed up in 1999, so we don't have decades worth of information on it, but average about 2,500 cases per year in the U.S. With the range of anywhere from 21, which was really the first days of West Nile virus being introduced into the country, and that it was only located within a few states those first couple years, but as it spread across the U.S. and finally reached the Pacific, we're seeing a lot of cases each year. So if I were to take out these outliers here, the average number of cases would actually be much higher than the 2,500 listed here. The biggest year was almost 10,000 cases. And we've kind of changed a little bit how we put cases in. So sometimes we get all of the West Nile fever cases, but this information is based on the numbers of just neuroinvasive disease. So we know with this particular virus, there are a lot more cases that aren't being reported just because of how the states decide to send us the information. And this also, because West Nile virus is so common, the blood supply in the U.S. is tested during the West Nile virus season for evidence of West Nile virus. So this also includes presumptive viremic blood donors in the numbers as well. So what they do is they test batches of blood that have been donated, and then if they get a positive, they'll go back and they'll test the individuals within that batch, and then they'll identify who had the West Nile virus and toss that out so that they don't give it to somebody else through a transfusion or other blood products. So 2014, for the entire US, you can see how widespread it is, but the majority of counties in the plains in the middle of the country This is the Culex tarsalis causing that phenomenon. There's a lot of Culex tarsalis out west, again in California, in the flooded areas of the central valleys of California. But you can see 353 cases for Texas. And looking at this over the last several years, there tends to be a trend in Texas where you have a lot of cases in the Houston area. You have a lot of cases kind of in this area. But you have a lot of pink up in here with low numbers of cases, but then I understand that nobody lives in the panhandle, so that's actually a pretty high incidence compared to the number of people living in that area. And then this is getting into that Culex tarsalis habitat for the state. So if you kind of draw a line down the center of the state, Culex tarsalis is more abundant out here, and Quincke fasciatus is what's going to be driving the transmission in the eastern part of the state. So our friend dengue virus, I include this because in 2010, the CDC made dengue a reportable virus. So some of the information I have on my slides is from the pre-requirement of reporting dengue cases to the CDC. This is a urban-suburban virus. Again, that's where the vectors live. This is our friends Aedes aegypti, Aedes albopictus, that we have been talking about for much of the conference. The primary host is humans in this case, so there's not that wildlife component in the dengue transmission cycle. So it makes it it's a little easier. I say just a little easier to control people than it is wildlife, but I guess it kind of depends on your perspective. So 2010 is when dengue became a reportable disease. So you see the numbers of cases in travelers in the US doesn't mean that we weren't getting a lot more people coming into the US with dengue. It just means that we weren't having them reported to the CDC. We have had local transmission every year since 2009. I know from the back you can't see, but there is a little bar there with a couple of cases ranging from 2 to 49 cases last year, or the year before last in 2013. There were 24 cases of dengue in South Texas down along the border. So there was actually quite a lot of dengue going on last year of locally acquired cases that you may not have heard about. So the imported average, and I'm just basing that average after the time that it became a reportable disease because those numbers are probably closer to what's going on. They're probably still lower than because we don't always get every case report come in through ARBANET, but we're averaging about 500 cases a year of imported dengue in the US. And in the last, since 2009, we have been actually averaging 25 locally acquired cases in the US per year. So dengue, people think of it as a disease that is on the horizon, might be introduced into the US, but actually it can be considered endemic in the US at this point. So imported dengue cases, out of the 462 cases reported to us last year, 24 cases were reported in Texas, and these are the counties. And for those of you who are sitting at the front of the room, the A+ students, you can probably actually see how many cases in each of these counties was reported, because there is a little white number in there as well. I think, I know that's Harris County. I'm not from Texas, so I don't know all of your counties. El Paso had 3. I'm guessing that's, help me out here, San Antonio? Travis County? Okay. So again, it's an urban disease, so it tends to be where your bigger cities are, but also along the border. You get a lot of spillover from Mexico. So if you hear of a lot of dengue cases going on in northern Mexico, then you're probably going to see a lot of cases corresponding right across the Rio Grande from wherever those cities are. Locally acquired dengue, last year there were only 6 cases, and they were in South Florida. Nothing in Texas, but I do want to point out that ArboNet also catches what's going on in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, where dengue is very endemic, and there were several hundred cases in Puerto Rico. In fact, Puerto Rico always has several hundred cases, like 800 cases, 1,200 cases. Sometimes they have epidemic years where they will have 26,000 cases of dengue in those epidemic years. So it's within the U.S., certainly even if it's not within the states. Chikungunya virus. As Dr. Florin mentioned, it is now a reportable disease as of this year, so 2015 numbers are a reportable disease numbers, and just like dengue, it is an urban virus. In Africa, it is rural. We don't know what's going to happen in the Americas now that it is here, because just like when West Nile first came, and we didn't know what birds, what native birds were going to be important, what vectors might be important. We don't know what's going to go on with chikungunya. Like I mentioned, with the West Nile virus, it's not always the known vectors. So Culex nigripalpus is endemic to North America, and in Florida, that happens to be a major driver of West Nile virus. So we don't know what other mosquito species might be important in the U.S. yet. Certainly humans are the primary host. We do know that part of it, and we don't know what will happen with wildlife down the road. So chikungunya virus in the U.S. This is 2014 information for so the light blue are the travel-associated cases. So you can see that just about every state in the U.S. reported at least one traveler coming back with chikungunya in 2014. And then there were 11 locally acquired cases in South Florida last year. You saw this map before in my earlier presentation. 2015, we're 2 months into it, and we already have travel cases coming back into the U.S. These are the laboratory confirmed, so these are confirmed cases. They're not suspected cases that are represented in this map, because even though we may not have a really swift turnaround time in the U.S., we at least have the resources to test all of the cases that we get in. In Texas, you guys have had 3 cases to date in Texas. I can't tell you what particular counties they are in, because right now we don't have those maps on our USGS partnership, but this coming year, because it's now a reportable disease, those chikungunya maps will be available on that website. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a disease that you may not have heard of. This is a newly discovered arbovirus, so it falls within our purview of the branch I work with at CDC, and it's called Heartland virus. It was first isolated from a couple of farmers in northwest Missouri. These guys got sick. They thought maybe they had Ehrlichia, but the symptoms weren't quite right. When they started digging into what was going on, they discovered a new virus. And so these farmers had noticed tick bites, noticed ticks feeding on them right before they became ill, and that's why they were thinking that it was a different kind of tick-borne disease called Ehrlichia, but it turns out that it was not the bacteria, it was actually a virus. And then the severe fever and the thrombocytopenia and leukopenia, leukopenia just means reduction in those particular cell types, was kind of an odd finding. So since 2009, CDC started a study, got an IRB to work with several hospitals in the area, and actually has expanded from Missouri to look for patients with this disease to figure out what's going on with it. So since then, they have found another case in Tennessee and another case in Oklahoma. We really don't know what the public health burden is, but we did go out to where those initial cases were in Missouri and did collections of mosquitoes, we did collections of vertebrates, we did collections of ticks, and we did find it in ticks. So it looks like it is a tick-borne virus. It is a Buena viridae, a flebavirus, and the Lone Star tick, Amblyomma americanum, looks like this is the vector of it. And so this tick is very common in the southeast. We don't know exactly what the host reservoir is, but raccoons and deers seem to be some pretty good predictors of whether this virus is present or not. And there is a closely related virus which causes the same symptoms from China. And so based on that, we are a little concerned that this one might be a lot more widespread and a little bit more severe than. So this slide was actually supposed to be before I started talking about Heartland. So I'm going to go back to that slide in a minute. So we have these three cases in Missouri, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, but we don't know geographically how widespread this virus is in the United States. So Nick Komar worked with some of his wildlife collaborators and did a study looking at banked serum samples collected from wildlife throughout particularly the eastern US. So this slide here is a slide actually of the geographic distribution of the tick vector, Amblyomma americanum. You can see it's very widespread in Texas. And so with this retrospective serum survey, they looked at banked blood samples from deer, raccoons, coyote, moose. They looked at almost 1,500 animals from 19 different states. These are healthy adult trapped animals or animals that were deceased because of human causes, namely serum samples taken from deer from hunters at check stations. These samples were collected between 2009 and 2014, and they were tested with neutralizing antibodies, 4 neutralizing antibodies against Heartland virus. And what we found within the animals is that Heartland virus is very widespread in the eastern US. So even though we only have a few cases to date from these states here, we'd certainly have seropositive animals, including in Texas. And then not just widespread distribution of the virus, But these circles represent the number of seropositive animals from the sites where serum samples were taken. And so, like, the number of seropositive animals in the really big circles is between 13 and 16 animals out of all of the ones that were tested. You could see in Texas that it was probably only 1 or 2 animals way out here in West Texas that tested positive for it. So the fact that we're finding it from Maine to West Texas tells us that this virus is very widespread in the eastern US. So even though we haven't found cases for it in Texas, that doesn't mean that there haven't been cases for it in Texas. And because it's a new virus, physicians wouldn't necessarily be looking that it would be Heartland virus versus Ehrlichia or some other diagnosis. So 13 states with evidence of transmission, actually 14 states. The interesting thing is that even though you can find the vector up in the Northeast in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, it's not abundant up there, and they don't have very big populations. So there's probably another tick vector going on, or what we're detecting as Heartland virus may actually be a different virus that's very antigenetically related to it. So there could be an alternative vectors out there, such as Ixodes scapularis. And then this is just the year that the samples were collected from the different states. So that positive here in Texas was collected in 2010. It's not a recent collection. And then I wanted just to acknowledge briefly, these are all the people who worked on the Heartland virus, figuring out what ticks it was in, figuring out that we had a new virus in the US, and so forth. And then in addition to Heartland virus, and I'm not going to talk about it because we don't know much about it, but you may have heard in the news that there's another arbovirus that we think might be transmitted by ticks called Bourbon virus. And it has nothing to do with the chicken gumbo and bourbon in New Orleans. It's named after Bourbon County, Kansas, where the first and only patient to be known to have this virus lived. And I say lived because the only patient we know of who's ever had this virus is deceased. So the mortality rate at this point is 100%. But it is a Thagota virus, which is the first Thagota virus in North America to be shown to cause human disease. And then there are other Thagota viruses out there that are associated with ticks as a vector, and there's one associated with mosquitoes. So we will be doing similar studies with this new Bourbon virus to find out how widespread it is, how common it is it a public health burden? So you might want to stay tuned on that one as well, because if it turns out to be like Heartland virus, it's probably circulating more widespread than just Kansas. And if it turns out to be another amblyoma transmitted virus, then there's a high likelihood that it would be pretty much the same geographic distribution as that Heartland virus is.